As we carry these 20 years forward, I find sustenance in a continuing appreciation for all of those who rose to be more than ordinary people, and a father's pride in his daughter's selfless acts in the last moments of her life, acting with heroic calm to help those in the air and those on the ground. A legacy from Sarah that burns like an eternal flame.
Well, you were listening there to Mike Lowe. He, as he said, is the father of one of the flight attendants who died on 9/11, and he spoke about the unbearable sorrow that he and his family have faced. And now we're hearing a number of the names of the people who did perish on that day, and we'll be listening in to some of those.
Lawrence Christopher Abel.
Alana Abraham.
William F. Abrahamson.
Richard Anthony Aceto.
Heinrich Bernard Ackerman.
Paul Acquaviva.
Christian Adams.
Donald Leroy Adams.
Patrick Adams.
Shannon Lewis Adams.
Stephen George Adams.
Ignatius Udo Adanga.
Christy A. Adamo.
Terrence Edward Adderley Jr.
Sophia B. Otto.
And you can see there US President Joe Biden and his wife Jill, former presidents Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and their wives also listening in to the names. We'll be hearing all of the names over the course of the next few hours. Let's bring in Steve Clemons. He's the host of The Bottom Line, Al Jazeera's weekly show, and also editor-at-large of The Hill. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Steve, this is clearly a moment for mourning, but also very much a moment for reflection, and it comes at a very specific moment for the U.S. and the way that it sees itself. How do you think the country is reflecting upon its own identity in this moment?
It's a great question. I think the country is seeing a moment, as Kimberly Halkett said earlier, when people were unified. They were shocked that this could happen, and people of every background, every stripe and color, every part of society came together at a moment, and we're feeling the reflections and the memory of that today in a way we haven't felt in 20 years. And I think right now it's the foil of that unity that makes today's division and toxicity inside America really, really disturbing. I was getting chills just thinking about it as you were talking, listening to the gentleman after the moment of silence. But you know, I think that America right now is split and divided, and people have different senses of what has happened to the country since, and they're blaming each other inside the country for a nation that no longer has that unity of purpose and unity of place. And I think that is something that, while one may reflect on it tomorrow, we will still have, you know, sadly and unfortunately in the United States, you know, real divisions among people and what they believe this nation should be about and what ought to drive it. 9/11 is a memory of a moment when it was different. And I think, you know, tomorrow, 9/12, is going to be a day where hopefully people get back together and begin thinking about what they could do to rebuild that sort of unity. But today, America is a divided nation.
Steve, you talk about blame there, and there's obviously been a huge amount of blame being shifted around, especially in the last days of US presence in Afghanistan. And we've been watching that happen. Obviously, that was a direct link to what happened on 9/11. And even as the US was leaving, we were watching ISIL-K launch attacks, that suicide bomb outside the airport, the rockets being fired. Now, terror threats clearly remain, and many people are arguing that US presence in various countries has even created the climate for them to grow. In your mind, how successful has this so-called global war on terror been?
It has been tragically unsuccessful. I think that, you know, people who want to point to success say there have been no major terror attacks on the United States since 9/11. But within, we've had significant terror attacks, you know, lone wolves, others that have done this. And we have externally around the world, you know, just as many people who have been radicalized and who, see the United States in their targets among other nations and allies and people from around the world, clearly. But I think we have played into what some terrorists wanted, which is to overreact, overreach, and help create the problems that made the grievances that people feel in various parts of the country, made those terrorists look as if they were fighting for those people, that those grievances were legitimate. And I think that is a real tragedy, because nothing could be further from the truth, in my view. But the United States really did overreach. It overstayed so long in Afghanistan to a point it became the forgotten war. Now everyone is paying attention to it, but there was a long period of time where other challenges around it was just the war on simmer. But we still had people dying, we still had people reacting, we still had the costs of that building, both financially but in human lives, and also psychologically, frankly. And I think that hubris, as you just said, is something that's had extraordinary costs on our reputation and brand around the world. We used to be, in my view, at least for some, a beacon on the hill, something they could look up to. Democracy meant something. The way we ran our economy meant something. All of that has come crashing down. And when you think about why would another nation follow America right now? There are a lot of other choices they have. We're not the compelling frame for people to aspire to right now. And I think that is a result of what started with 9/11, but our behaviors after that.
Steve, we're watching family members here hold up pictures of the people that they lost and read out their names. And these were civilians, nearly 3,000 civilians who died on 9/11. But at the same time, we also know about thousands of other civilian deaths that have happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, even today, these details that have emerged about that drone strike in Kabul, that it was an aid worker for a U.S. NGO that the U.S. actually attacked. How reflective is that now of what's happened to the way that warfare is being conducted post 9/11?
Well, it just shows the limit of the all-knowing, all-seeing cyber world that we've built, that there are real human lives and they don't always match up with what intelligence thinks. It's an atrocity. These are the kinds of things that one would never imagine the United States doing, a kind of, I'm sure that people regret and have great regret for what occurred, but it is symptomatic. And I found this, when we saw a lot of what was released in WikiLeaks, that we saw so many innocent families that had deaths in the families, had assassinations, people that had been killed during the war, and that information hidden from them in certain parts of the WikiLeaks that came together. So this is not just something that happened days ago. It's been happening throughout these wars. And I think when you ask about the reflection, the consciousness of that, I honestly can't say America is at the point where it realizes the blowback that will come back from this and the atrociousness and horror of that happening to other people at our hand is something I don't think has been fully digested and understood yet. It has by me, but I think that a lot of others still view this role, this security obsession of the United States as one that's justified. And I don't, but that's one of the points of divide in our nation.
Indeed. Steve Clemons there, the host of The Bottom Line, Al Jazeera's weekly show. Steve, we'll be coming back to you, so do stay with us. But for now, let's listen into a few more of those names being read out at that memorial. That's going to continue for several hours, but these are family members who are reading out the names of their loved ones.
Watching over us, and even though I never met you in person, I still miss you a lot. Mom always tells me all the crazy fun things you did, and I'm sure if you were here, I'd probably be doing them with you. Thank you for being the best guardian angel and for sending us Killian. We know he can see you. Mom also says I have your lovable charm and fearlessness. Not only do I have your charm, but I'm honored to have your name as my middle name. You, Pop-Up, and Dad have inspired me to follow in your footsteps and become a firefighter too. We hope you will continue to watch over us and keep us healthy and safe. We love you so much, Uncle Chris.
And my sister, Cecilia Elizabeth Richard Lawson. Dear Cece, it's been 20 years since you left us. I remember this day as if it was yesterday. You are greatly missed by our mother, your sisters, your nieces, your nephews. It was such a sad day on September 11th. I remember you working at the Pentagon, and when they told us the airplane had attacked the Pentagon, I couldn't believe it. From the building of where I worked at EPA, I could see the smoke. And I couldn't believe that you're gone. I just want to say I love you, and we miss you. Thank you so much.
Well, you're listening to family members there read out the names of their loved ones at the site of Ground Zero, where the Twin Towers and the World Trade Center once stood. Well, if you are just joining us now on Al Jazeera, it is shortly after 13 GMT, and we are listening in to a live memorial service from Ground Zero in New York, where we are marking the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. We have a number of presidents, former and current, in attendance. We don't expect to hear from them today, but as you can see, they are there to honor the people who were lost on that day. Let's bring in our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett. Kimberly, can you talk us through a little more of what to expect in the coming hours? I know the mood there has been very somber, and it's set to continue, really.
Yeah, the somber mood is expected to continue as we hear the names of the victims continuing to be read. The reason that they do this year after year is to put a face to those names and to try and make sure that they didn't die in vain. So what we're hearing and experiencing right now is something that those that put this event together every year feel is important, to continue to keep those names alive, because they are people's mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and grandparents. And so they do this. It does take a long time, but this is a part of the ceremony that many of the family members look forward to, when they can hear that name again, a name they don't hear spoken often because it has been 20 years since they passed. And so this is something that is done to not only remember those that died, but to make sure that this is a part of America that is never forgotten in the history books. And so that is what's taking place at Ground Zero behind me. And I should point out that as we look at these pictures, if you see those pools of water, this is the site where one of the towers, or if you're looking at the other one, the other tower was located. These are the very sites where these lives were lost. And so this is hallowed ground. This is many of these people have still not been identified in terms of their remains. 20 years later, they are still going through that process. I believe it's about 40% complete, which means that this is the only place that many of these family members have, is to come and remember their loved ones in this very public setting. They aren't able to go to a private cemetery because the remains are still in that spot, or have not been identified, or were incinerated in the fire, then the wreckage and the carnage that came following the toppling of those towers. So that's why this is such a lengthy memorial service that occurs every year. But this 20th anniversary, particularly important, because what's happening here is that people are remembering not only how this affected them personally, but how this affected the country. And you hear there the ringing of the bell that is happening with another minute of silence.
May God bless our fallen brothers and sisters, their families, their friends, and their loved ones. He says, I'll see you in my dreams. The road is long and seeming without end. The days go on, but I'll remember you, my friend. And though you're gone, and my heart's been emptied, it seems, I'll see you in my dreams. I got your guitar here by my bed, all your favorite records, and all the books that you read. And though my soul feels like it's been split at the seams, I'll see you in my dreams. I'll see you in my dreams, when all our summers have come to an end. I'll see you in my dreams. We'll meet and live and laugh again. I'll see you in my dreams. Yeah, up around the river bend, for death is not the end. 'Cause I'll see you in my dreams. I'll see you in my dreams, when all our summers have come to an end. I'll see you in my dreams. We'll meet and live and love again. I'll see you in my dreams. Yeah, up around the river bend, for death is not the end. And I'll see you in my dreams. You in my, I'll see you in my dreams.
Well, you were just listening there to Bruce Springsteen paying tribute to the nearly 3,000 people who were lost on 9/11. This is the memorial service 20 years on at the site of Ground Zero, and we are hearing family members continue to read out the names of the loved ones that have perished there. Let's bring our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, back in. Kimberly, I recall we were talking about the names earlier, and something that really struck me upon visiting the memorial was how all the names are actually etched into the sides of those huge waterfalls, and that they're all grouped together either by colleagues or friends or families. And I'm curious, as someone who's living in the United States, what does that space now mean, not only to New Yorkers, but Americans?
It is certainly something that is revered and respected and reflected. And I had the opportunity to walk amongst those spots that is where the tower stood. And I hadn't stood there for 20 years. The last time I was there was about a month before the September 11th attacks. And I realized how much had changed. And it got me very emotional. It was, even as I'm listening to these names being read now, and even as we just listened to Bruce Springsteen talking about dreams and how this is not the end, For many people, there was a finality to what happened. Even though there's hope for a better future, many people lost the opportunity right there at ground zero to have continued relationships with some of their loved ones. And it was really a day that America changed. Whether you were at ground zero and had a family member in one of those buildings, whether it was in the Pentagon that you may have known someone, or even if you had a loved one on the plane that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, there's no question that the United States changed at that moment. And the terror of that moment as that change was occurring is one that is etched in the minds of every single person that experienced those hours where they simply didn't know what was going on. I can even speak from my own experience that when the first tower was struck, people thought this was a horrible accident. They didn't realize America was under attack and that there would be more attacks and that this was coordinated. In fact, they thought that this was simply an accident. So that's why there are so many first responders that died in what ensued. They rushed to the scene to try and save people. And when that second tower was hit, that is the moment where people realized that this was something much bigger. And I can tell you in Washington, as I watched this unfold, I will never forget. It was a very clear day, much like it is today. And people were watching this on TV almost thinking it wasn't real, that it was like a movie. Because up until that point, Americans had this sense of security that they were invincible, that nothing bad could happen in the United States, nothing bad here, and all of that innocence was lost at that moment. And I can tell you the terror of running and not really sure where to go, where was safe, because soon we were getting reports that there was also something happening at the Pentagon. There was talk about potentially something happening at the U.S. Capitol, which turned out not to be the case. But we do know that there was a plane likely destined for the U.S. Capitol. That was Flight 93 that crashed in Pennsylvania. So people were in disbelief. And that was a day that changed America forever. And those that can remember it, remember this moment and those moments 20 years ago, and it's painful.
White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett there following events for us at Ground Zero today. We'll come back to you in a moment, Kimberly, but for now, thank you very much. Let's cross over to Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where we can speak to our correspondent, Alan Fisher. Alan, as you were hearing there from Kimberly, there was obviously United Flight 93 that ended up being hijacked and then crashed into the field where I believe you're standing. What's planned for that site today?
Well, George Bush, who was president on that day, everyone remembers the pictures of him getting the news of the attacks while reading to young children at a school in Florida. He will be here with his wife, Laura, and he will make some remarks. And Kamala Harris, who is the vice president, will make the keynote address. Joe Biden will visit the site later. This was an unremarkable field on an unremarkable hill in an unremarkable part of America, but this is where many people believe that the fight back against what became known as the war on terror actually began. Flight 93 left 28 minutes late, flying from Newark to San Francisco. It was meant to be an ordinary flight. There were 44 people on board, 2 pilots, 5 members of crew, 33 passengers, and 4 hijackers. And 28 minutes into the flight, that's when the hijackers made their move. People called their families to let them know that they were on a flight that had been hijacked, and then, because of the phones on the plane, they were able to find out what happened in New York, what had happened in Washington, and they realized that this wasn't an ordinary hijacking, that they were on a flight with people who were carrying out a suicide mission. And in those moments, they voted, the people on board voted to decide to start to try and take the plane back. And so they boiled water, they used the drinks cart to ram the cockpit, and they made their way towards the flight deck of United Flight 93, which at that point had programmed in Washington, D.C., and was heading for the U.S. Capitol. That comeback was ultimately unsuccessful, captured in those immortal words, "Let's roll." and people thought that that would be the fight that would restore the plane. But the pilot, realizing that he wasn't going to get to his objective, did what he was told to do, which was crash the plane. And so it came down in this unremarkable field in an unremarkable part of the country at almost 900 kilometers an hour. Everyone on board died, but this is now sacred ground, and that is what they will mark in the next hours or so as the families of the crew and the families of the 33 passengers come here to remember what happened exactly 20 years ago.
Of course, incredible acts of heroism there. Alan Fisher for us in Pennsylvania. We'll be coming back to Alan a bit later, but let's now bring in Steve Clemens again. He's the host of The Bottom Line. That's Al Jazeera's weekly show, and also editor-at-large of The Hill. He joins us now from Washington, D.C. Steve, Alan was just talking there about how the war on terror is perceived to have begun, perhaps even on Flight 93. I was looking at some of the numbers, and between 2018 and 2020, the U.S. was engaged in some form of counterterrorism activity in 85 countries. I'm curious about the legacy that this has left for regional partners, regional governments that seem to have themselves come under threat because of their perceived link with the U.S.
We developed an amazing apparatus for global spying and intelligence and awareness. These are some of the capacities Americans were shocked to hear about when Edward Snowden revealed them. You know, Edward Snowden, who is considered by many in the United States to be a real traitor, was saying nonetheless that America had the ability to spy on anyone through their phone, through their computer. And that is was a global capacity. And as you talk about the footprint of this national security capacity and obsession, we divided the world between those nations who were going to work with us in doing that, and those that essentially were across the line and were not. It was a very defining moment, as Kimberly Halkett said a minute ago. You know, maybe Flight 93, that moment, the morning of 9/11, that was the day that the terror that shook America into these behaviors of, you know, a very, very overwhelming commitment that these individuals, these terrorists, these small groups that were non-state actors, we were going to capture them and kill them and detain them and know about them wherever they were in the world. It was an extraordinary shift and change in our attention.
Steve, you talk there about how identity has changed in the U.S. There were so many different ways of trying to combat terror threats, and this idea that the U.S. could intervene abroad and try to prevent threats from occurring domestically, it suggests that the power intervening has some idea that they live with more civilized standards of behavior. Right now, over the last 20 years, we've certainly seen the global power dynamic shift. So who now gets to decide what civilization is?
You know, I mean, I think it's up for grabs. We've seen, you know, the United States is very divided about all of these things. And, you know, I wrote a piece once and said, look, we have to understand what terrorists are trying to do. Terrorists are performing on a stage for an audience of people that they want to look legitimate for. So when they strike, when they kill, when they take the actions they did on 9/11 that were applauded in some parts of the world, it was because there are parts of the world that were feeling deep grievances, you know, over various issues. And my comment was, let's seduce the audience. Let's make the audience love what we're doing. Let's bring them back to us. Otherwise, you're just trying to kill actors on a stage, and there are an unlimited number of them. I think that is one of the fundamental misconnects that I think at some level, you know, when you look at the national security reflections of the generals and the admirals and many of the commanders and the political leaders that were involved with reacting to 9/11, there is an understanding that we engaged in serious overreach, that we went too far, that we, you know, with Guantanamo and so many renditions of people to third countries, torture, so many things that we did that completely were the antithetical to the DNA of civil rights and and basic legal justice in the United States. That's how far we went. We went so far that we began to undo the various kinds of things that we're most proud of as a nation. And so I think when you talk about civilization, hopefully we get a reset in what that means. But right now it's a bit up for grabs. America is not the dominant definer of that anymore, nor is Europe. I mean, so I think to a certain degree, we have an ad hoc world and we have to find our way out of it.
Steve Clemens there, the host of The Bottom Line, Al Jazeera's weekly show and editor-at-large of The Hill. Stay with me, Steve, and we'll come back to you in a little bit, but I want to take us from those live pictures that you're watching in New York to the Pentagon. Now, you'll recall after those first two planes hit the North and South Towers there at Ground Zero, there was another plane, American Airlines Flight 77, that crashed into the U.S. Pentagon. That's being marked today.
Petty Officer First Class Joseph J. Piesier, Jr., United States Navy. Lisa J. Raines. Deborah A. Ramser. Rhonda Sue Rasmussen. Petty Officer First Class Marcia D. Ratchford, United States Navy. Martha M. Reski.
So they're at the Pentagon. You're watching live pictures where they are reading the names of those who were lost at the Pentagon. So across the country, this day, 20 years on, is being marked at multiple sites. Well, you'll recall the 9/11 attacks then led to a 20-year war in Afghanistan as U.S. forces and their allies sought to target al-Qaeda fighters and the Taliban, which was accused of harboring them. 20 years later, the Taliban is back in control, ousting the Afghan government that was propped up by the U.S. as Washington withdrew its forces. Tens of thousands of Afghans were killed, many lives turned upside down. Charles Stratford reports now from Kabul on people's hopes for the future there.
Inzal Gul's home was destroyed during fighting between US-led forces and the Taliban 14 years ago. His brother and one of his sons was killed. He and his family have lived in this camp for internally displaced people in Kabul ever since. He blames the United States and its allies for the pain they've endured.
In the past 20 years, we've suffered so much that at times we've hardly been able to eat for days. All Afghans have been through terrible hardships, bombardments, fighting, our houses destroyed. The war lasted so long because we are Afghans and we will fight for our country.
In central Kabul today, Taliban fighters guard former government buildings and abandoned foreign embassies. The challenges the movement faces after what it describes as victory in a fight for national sovereignty are immense. It's been 20 years since the 9/11 attacks and the soon after US-led invasion to hunt down Osama bin Laden and remove the Taliban from power. Then followed what the Taliban describe as 2 decades of foreign occupation. The foreign forces have gone, the Taliban are back in power. And the UN says that Afghanistan is facing a humanitarian and economic catastrophe. This is the old American embassy, once a hub of CIA and military planning and one of the most important centres of US foreign policy in the world. Now it's just an empty shell. Hamid Gul was 24 when US-led coalition forces invaded. He is scared about what the future holds.
In the last 20 years, my hopes changed, but now they've been left behind. All Afghans thought we would get close to the rest of the world when the Americans were here, but now we have to wait and see again what the future will bring.
Despite his doubts, Hamid says he wants the world to give the Taliban a chance.
All my life I've experienced only war. I just want to sleep with ease. I just want to wake up with no fear. I'm tired of saying goodbye to my family as I leave for work, afraid I'll never see them again.
This is one of many graveyards on hillsides surrounding Kabul. Here are buried some of the estimated 50,000 Afghan civilians killed in the last 20 years. Inzagul says he also wants the international community to accept the Taliban. He wants education for his children who were born into war. He wants the chance for them all to start their lives again. Charles Strafford, Al Jazeera, Kabul.
Well, now, meanwhile, a New York Times investigation has revealed that the U.S. may have mistakenly targeted an aid worker in its last air attack in Afghanistan. 10 people, including 7 children, were killed in that drone strike that was targeting ISIL fighters in Kabul back in August. Charlotte Bellis has more now from the Afghan capital.
In that drone strike, the Pentagon said that it hit ISIL bombers who were planning an imminent attack on the airport. We know that civilians were killed in that, but now this investigation has used CCTV footage, has talked to more than a dozen of the target's family members and colleagues, and found out that he was actually a worker for a US aid organization. They also showed that he was loading canisters of water into the car and not explosives, as the Pentagon had said. And they're also alleging that there wasn't secondary explosions, which is what the Pentagon used to prove that they knew that there were explosives in the car. So the Pentagon has responded saying that we are assessing results of the airstrike. We work hard to prevent civilian casualties, and it was based on good intelligence. But for Afghans here, there's a lot of criticism, and they also find it quite symbolic that the last airstrike that happened in this nearly 20-year war killed civilians, and now there's big question marks over whether they had the right person.
Well, now, Pakistan International Airlines says it will restart flights to Afghanistan from Monday. It says it has clearance to operate commercially now to and from Kabul airport. The airline says it's had requests from aid agencies and journalists which show encouraging demand. Now, moving on to some other news, and Israeli police have caught 4 of the 6 Palestinians who escaped from a maximum security prison on Monday. 2 still remain at large. The men escaped by tunneling their way out of Gilboa prison in northern Israel. The jailbreak prompted a large-scale manhunt by the Israeli army and law enforcement agencies. One of the 4 prisoners who's been recaptured is Zakaria Zubeidi. He was a high-profile figure in Fatah's armed wing, the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. Now, at least 20 people have been killed in Myanmar in clashes between troops and a local armed group in the western Magwe region. The country has been in turmoil since February's coup, and a crackdown on dissent has already killed more than 1,000 people. In some areas, people have formed local defense forces, arming themselves with homemade weapons to fight back against government soldiers. On Tuesday, a shadow government made up of politicians in hiding or in exile declared a nationwide uprising against the military. Well, there are currently 2 storms spinning closer to land in the Asia-Pacific region, and there's also been more flooding in India. Here's Jeff with a look at the world weather.
Hello, good to be with you. The monsoon rains have been so intense, we're seeing flooding around Delhi. And in fact, it's led to some flight delays because the airport has been flooded out as well. And this is really where our danger zone is, toward the northwest, as we look toward Gujarat, Rajasthan, Konkan and Goa, but also toward the northeast. Let me take you there. That's because we've got a deepening area of low pressure in the Bay of Bengal. This could become cyclonic, and it's just whipping rain around all around the Bay of Bengal. So the Indian state of Odisha could see about 200 millimeters of rain in the days to come. As we look toward Asia Pacific, a lot going on here. So first, let's focus on Quang as it slams into central Vietnam. 500,000 soldiers on standby to help in whatever way they can. You know, I think anywhere from 300 to 600 millimeters of rain we can expect, and those winds to clip up to 72 kilometers per hour. Then we've got Super Typhoon Shantu, and the waves around this one, 17 meters, but it's veering toward the east, not looking to make landfall over Taiwan, but it's still going to strike you with 100 millimeters of rain, and then we'll see those wind gusts up to about 85 kilometers per hour. We've got our plum rains working across the East China Sea, slamming into southern Japan on Sunday. That's it for me.
Well, still ahead for you here on Al Jazeera. We'll have more on those commemorations in the United States as people come together to remember those who died on September 11th, 20 years ago today. There, you were seeing some live pictures from New York. There's also commemorations taking place at the Pentagon and also in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where families are gathering to read out the names of the loved ones they lost.
on air or online, be part of the debate.
For Pacific people,